Welcome to Fireside Chats. I am Will Fenton, Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I am suspecting, in fact, I know for a fact, having seen some of the attendees, that you're well acquainted with the Library Company. We're grateful for your engagement. But for those of you who might be just sort of learning about us, we are an independent research library. We were originally founded by Benjamin Franklin, but today we have terrific program specializations in early Americana, print and visual culture, women's history, African-American history, and political economy and business history. And so this series, it's a weekly webinar. I started this last April. I didn't really count on it being weekly, nor did I expect it to continue until now. But I am indebted to everyone who volunteered when I put out a call back in April and volunteered with the predictable gusto of our learning community, and it really helped me sustain this. And first and foremost, that goes to our research fellows. We have a research program that's been in place for, I think we're coming up on our 34th year. And those fellows are really our lifeblood as an institution. And so while we're in a place where we're sort of in and out of being able to see each other in person, certainly being able to do things like this online at least make me feel a little better. So I hope the rest of you enjoyed as much as I do. You'll notice that this is a little different in format from some of the Zooms that you might have been on. Your camera is not enabled, your mic isn't enabled. You can say whatever you want about me and I won't hear it. But I do invite you to participate. And the way that you can do that, you'll see that there's a Q&A button, two overlapping dialogue bubbles. You click on that, you can submit a question at any time, and I will do my best to work through them. And points go to the person who gets their question in first, not only because I'll take note of it, but you're guaranteed that you'll get your question. We typically set aside about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. But enough of that from me. So we are joined tonight by Jordan Alexander Stein, who is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Fordham University, my alma mater. His publications include Avidly Reads Theory and the volume he co-edited with Laura Langer Cohen, Early African American Print Culture. Dr. Stein's research has been supported by a number of agencies, including and especially grants at HSP and an NEH postdoctoral fellowship at the Library Company. The research he conducted here eventuated in When Novels Were Books, which was published this year by Harvard University Press. More about which he will discuss tonight. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you very much, Will. Thanks for having me. The Library Company is my absolute favorite place to do research, and although I cannot be in the space, it is wonderful to share some kind of virtual space. Also, I want to thank the folks who are here. I have the list of attendees. I see friends from all over. I see people whose work I really admire. I see people I'm excited to get to talk to. So thank you all for being here on what is like a deeply weird night in America. I was saying to Will, my joke is that I'm used to being more interesting than Arizona, but maybe not tonight. In any case, thank you for being here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and that should give you the PowerPoint. See if this works. How's that? All right. What I thought I would do is I'm going to talk about this book that I wrote, and I'm going to do it in kind of a summary way. So I thought I would give you the kind of opening anecdote, which is an anecdote I enjoy. I'll summarize the argument, and then I'll do some show and tell. I'll walk you through some slides. This should take about 25 or 30 minutes. The place the book begins is with Samuel Johnson. And in January of 1759, Samuel Johnson writes a letter to his fellow Londoner and his publisher, William Strahan, and he requests a book. Johnson is at work on a tale that becomes, there you go, Rasselas, the Prince of Abyssinia. This is a fictional narrative. And this is eventually published in 2 volumes in a small format. It's an octavo, a little book. Johnson, 5 years before, had been the author of the Dictionary of the English Language, which substantially established his reputation. It was a major undertaking. It was a much larger book. It was printed as a folio. Books that are printed in larger formats are understood typically, certainly in the 18th century, were understood typically to be much more prestigious, much more important. Johnson has established his credentials with the Dictionary of the English Language in 1755. So the question that I open my book with is, why is Rasselas then printed as an octavo, as a small format book, which is less prestigious, less significant? Let me pause here to just talk a little bit about what the difference in size actually means, because as you're looking at the screen, right, and this is something that happens with the digitization of books, is that every book appears to be the same size in your PDF. When I do these, or when I'm able to do these kinds of presentations in a rare books room, the size distinction becomes immediately obvious because you're looking at objects of two different sizes. In the virtual space, it's a little harder to do that. So I just want to underscore what I'm talking about. The size of a book depends on how many times the paper that was used to print it is folded. A folio is folded once to produce 4 pages per sheet. A quarto is folded 4 times, octavo 8 times, and it goes from there. The reason that, and some of you may know this, those of you who are familiar with the history of printing, but for those of you who aren't, the reason that it matters not what size the paper is, but how many times it's folded, is because in the hand press period, when printing presses look like this, the paper tray, which is that horizontal element there below where the press is, the paper tray is a standard size. So the paper that goes in there has to always be the same size. It would be more complicated to produce trays that are of varying sizes than it would be to just fold the paper. And this is why books work the way they do. This is another example. This is actually from the Franklin Court Historical Reconstruction in Philadelphia. This is a gentleman using a printing press, and you can see the paper in the tray. But again, this is the issue with size. All right. Rasselas, as I said, is an octavo. You can see with the scale here of the hand, it's a small format book. The Dictionary of the English Language is a large book, much more prestigious. So the question on the table is, why if Johnson is very successful in a large format, in a prestigious format, why then print his next work in a small format? The answer that I give in the opening of my monograph, When Novels Were Books, is that the size of a book in the 18th century indicates not just its prestige, not just its importance, not just its significance, but I argue its genre. That size formats, not definitively, but generally track with genre in ways that book historians and literary scholars have not fully considered. Printing Rasselas as an octavo in this kind of small format likens it to many books whose genre it resembled: fictional works, character-driven works, continuous narratives. And this includes many of the candidates for the kind of still unresolved winner of the designation first novel in English. Pamela by Samuel Richardson, Orinoco by Afra Ben, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, all of these works were also printed in octavo. My book, When Novels Were Books, argues that the history of the book and the history of the novel are related histories. It takes seriously the fact, usually beneath notice, that novels are, and for most of the first 3 centuries of their existence, have been books. The reason that this fact, the materiality, the physical properties of a book are usually beneath notice has to do with the fact that the history of the novel is typically studied as a history of the evolution of literary form. It's not the object, the material aspects of books that matter, it's their contents. A very foundational version of this argument appeared in 1957 in a book called The Rise of the Novel by Ian Watt, which, as you can see from the subtitle, lays out as its major examples Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding. Watt argues that the novel is a form in the sense that it's an epistemology. It's a unique way of knowing something and of representing that knowledge. In his own, oh no. Sorry, hold on one second, slide's not working. Nope. Well, I had a quote from Watt. I'm sorry, technical difficulties. Well, in any case, the quote's not loading. Watt says that the thing that is significant about the English novel is not just what it represents, but the way it represents it. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's one of the kind of famous summary quotes from his study. 1957 was a long time ago. It's more than 60 years ago, and yet the terms that Watt sets up, that the novel is an epistemology, that it's best attended to in terms of its form, is something that has been and continues to be hugely influential in studies of the novel. These are just two, I actually had more pictures here, but they're not rendering. But these are just two of the really excellent studies in the last few years that continue to focus on literary form in relationship to the English novel. I'm not against these works. I think they're fantastic, but they're also, my argument about materiality is trying to add to or supplement the formal account of what the novel is. In, wrong side. Okay, in When Novels Were Books, I take a long view. I look at the changing patterns of book ownership that begin in the 17th century, and this is the period when English common readers would begin to own books. In other words, people who are not scholars or gentlemen begin to own books. So I started in the 17th century as patterns for book ownership change, and I take it all the way kind of to the middle of the 19th century with the invention of literary criticism, which is the thing that starts to tell stories about the history of the novel. At the early end of the story in the 17th century, I show the ways that novels are representing characters, that is to say, vulnerable figures. This is an illustration, this is 1755, Joseph Highmore illustration of Pamela undressing, right? And the vulnerability, the nudity, but also the physical vulnerability to which she's subject in the sexual assault that this follows the scene. I argue that these kinds of bodily vulnerability, characterological vulnerability, that novels represent with some amount of consistency, show up in the kinds of religious books that common readers owned for 100 years prior. The claim here is that for a reader in the middle of the 18th century to pick up a novel, they would experience something formally as well as materially continuous with the religious books they would have read and owned. In the modern world, we understand religion and novels to belong to different categories. We experience religion as a religious book as a matter of piety and a novel as a matter of secular entertainment. The argument that I unfold in When Novels Were Books is that this just wasn't true in the 18th century. It becomes true in the 19th century, and then that history is retrospectively projected backward, but it absolutely was not true for most of the 18th century. Where we modern readers experience a disjuncture between religion and fiction. Again, 18th century readers did not. That's the argument of the book. What I wanted to do is to now walk you through a couple of examples that I'm interested in this kind of long view of the changing usage of books in Europe through the 18th century. The image that you're looking at is just a page from the Gutenberg Bible. Many of you may have seen these kinds of images before. This is printed in Latin. This page happens to be illuminated. You'll notice that although there are kind of headers at the top of the page, so we know that we're in Genesis, right? There is nothing about the layout of this book that orients us to kind of chapter and verse. We are used to being able to read the Bible in a manner that allows us to kind of open it at random. And especially for Protestants, we can open it at random and expatiate or extrapolate on particular verses. The thing that is interesting about the first printed Bible is that that was not a feature or convention that was available. This gradually changes, and so Gutenberg Bible is 1450, about 4. There's uncertainty between 1453 and 1455. About 100 years later, in the 16th century, when you start to get Bibles printed in the vernacular, this is an Olivetin Bible printed in France, but you see there's a much greater use of ornamental type. There's subheadings, there's marginal notations. This is a book that's printed to allow people to dip into as they need. So what the format, the layout of books is doing is it's adjusting, it's developing in order to accommodate certain kinds of reading practices. Accommodate, but arguably also encourage, although there's a little bit of a chicken and egg game here. These conventions translate into, are borrowed by books that are not Bibles in the late 17th century. And the example I have is from Thomas Shepard's Theses Sabbaticae. And this is a book of religious doctrine. We could imagine it's biblical commentary, but it's not a Bible. And yet it's being laid out with the use of ornamental type, with the use of subheadings, annotations, marginal notations. It looks very much visually like the Olivetan Bible, even though it's printed in English and that is printed in French. This borrowing of what we would call graphic designs, but what are typographical conventions, this borrowing of typographical conventions is part of how the genre of the book is established. We know that this is a religious book in part because it looks like a religious book, never mind what its contents are. This is an argument about the materiality of books. You might be thinking that, well, there are a lot of 17th century books and maybe a lot of them look like this. I'm going to give you a different example. This is also a religious book. It's a treatise, it's a printed sermon. You see that it's laid out quite differently. It's a continuous narrative. It has space in the margins, but there are no notations. Presumably a motivated reader could make their own notations and their own study guide. We know what page we're on and what the topic of the book is, but we don't know exactly what chapter we're in. Right? This is a book whose genre, but also whose use is imagined to be different. And lest this just seems like a difference between two books, both this book that you're looking at and Theses Sabbaticae were published in London, both in the same year, 1649, and both by the same printer, John Rothwell. In other words, this really, the choice of layout is a choice. And these are conventions that I argue in my study have to do with the genres that the printers imagined these books to belong to. So this example of Bibles and related books is a way of just giving you, these are just slides I happen to have, they're ones I discuss in the book, but they're ways of giving you an example of how the materiality, the physicality of books, not just in terms of size, but also in terms of what's on the page, are linked to the genre of books. I want to give you one more example that runs through a couple of chapters that I enjoy. And it has to do with it's a kind of a hinge example in my study, because a lot of these 17th century books that are borrowing conventions from Bibles can be read, unlike the one you're looking at, more like this, they can be read at random. You can open them and at any moment you sort of are oriented at the text, you know where you might be. But they're not necessarily designed to be read continuously. And there are a lot of these books. There's a whole kind of category of books that historians know as devotional steady sellers. These are popular books that ordinary readers would buy. They're books of religion, but they're thick. One historian calls them short, tubby bricks. That's Stephen Foster. It's a phrase that's shown up in most of the reviews of my book. People really like that phrase, short, tubby bricks, but that's a lot of what these books look like. But these are not books that are owned by readers who necessarily have a lot of leisure time. And so the fact that you can open them at random and be oriented to the contents of the book is understood to be a boon. I argue that it's out of these devotional books that what become early novels develop, at least generically and in terms of format. The hinge text is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress in a lot of different ways. Here we go. Pilgrim's Progress in a lot of different ways shows continuity with these devotional steady sellers that borrowed conventions from early Bibles, but it's a continuous narrative. That's its distinction. It's a continuous narrative. It's meant to be read more or less cover to cover. And that's the thing that makes it a kind of transitional object between these devotional works and early novels. One of the things that I enjoy talking about in my book, and I'm pulling from a couple different chapters and summarizing here, so I don't have particular example. But Pilgrim's Progress is something I track because it's a work that's never been out of print. It was first published in 1678. It was abundantly reprinted in the 17th century, even though it appeared in the last quarter of it. And it's never been out of print. It's probably been translated into more languages than almost any book in the history of the world. One of the things that I enjoy doing in When Novels Were Books is trying to track a lot of these different material manifestations of Pilgrim's Progress. Sometimes it gets shortened, sometimes it gets illustrated, but sometimes it gets repackaged. So here's an example of what the book looked like. This is, I believe, an original 17th century binding. Not an easy thing to lay one's hands on. And you can see from the kind of gloved hand that it's a small format book. But it's a short tubby brick. It looks physically like a lot of these devotional study sellers in whose class and in whose genre, I argue, it belongs and from which it emerged. Pilgrim's Progress, however, gets repackaged. Because it's reprinted so many times, it gets repackaged. And it stops looking, in many ways, like a devotional study seller. Here's an 18th century example. This does look like it's been rebound. But this is a slightly fancier cover. First of all, there's a kind of, it's not extremely elaborate in its design, but it is somewhat. Sorry, getting a call. Let me give you a 19th century example. Right, this is another Pilgrim's Progress. It's illustrated edition. It has a much more ornamental and elaborate cover. You can see it's a little less fat. It's a little taller and skinnier. This is packaged. This is Pilgrim's Progress. This is this devotional narrative from the 17th century that has been repackaged and repurposed to look in many ways like a 19th century novel. It's from here that we end up with a kind of Pilgrim's Progress marketed as it is in our modern world as just another textbook, as just another paperback narrative, like so many novels in this series. This transition, this evolution in the physical presentation of the object is part of what I'm interested in, because these different objects, I argue, class the same book in relation to different genres. Those are the examples that I have. There are others in the book, and I would certainly be happy to talk about it. But I'd love to turn it over to questions and see what people are thinking.
Thank you so much, Jordan. So I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to encourage anyone else who's got a much more incisive question than me to dive in. I'm thinking, in terms of the secularization argument that comes up in your introduction, one of the things that I thought was really fascinating there, which I think you paraphrased nicely here, but just to recap to make sure that I've got it, is that basically as you have a Protestant press that starts to emerge in the mid to late 18th century, that breaks away from the broader print market. And so the novel it's secular as a product of changes in that religious publishing area. And I'm curious to know, like, when you were talking about, the two different editions of Pilgrim's Progress, one of which looks, as you said, it is, short, tubby brick. It has those wide margins, and then it sort of elongates, and I'm assuming the margins maybe shrink a little. Like, are there other pieces of that broader print market that this emerging novel is drawing inspiration from, now that it's sort of disassociated from that Protestant press?
That's a great question. And it's a complication of the argument in the book that I minimized in this discussion, but I'm happy to elaborate it. I spent a lot of time, and I telegraphed this a little bit in my comments, but I spent a lot of time thinking about how, in fact, religious books and novels were understood to be more continuous than different for most of the 18th century. And again, Pilgrim's Progress is this kind of hinge text, which is often understood to be an early novel, but that's a retroactive classification. It's not what this text would have looked like, I think, to readers at the time. How could it? But what but these things kind of coexist. What we understand now to be novels seem to emerge out of the media ecology that, at least in the Anglophone world, that religious books largely dominate. In the last quarter of the 18th century, things start to shift a little bit, and for a couple of different reasons. But one of them is that you start to get the rise of philanthropic societies. So these are I mean, it's the origin of modern philanthropy. It's not the Salvation Army, but it's things like that, things that are kind of religious in motive, but not specifically aligned with a particular church, that are collecting money to do charity work. Many religious societies, they're known to historians as voluntary associations, which is the term that I use in the book. But many voluntary associations decide that like what would be good works would be to pool their money and print religious texts to hand out. Some want to print Bibles, but it turns out it's really expensive to print Bibles because they use a lot of paper, and paper is always the most expensive aspect of book production. So people get interested in tracts and short works, excerpts of things, but because these are largely given away for free, there's always an interest in reducing cost. One way that voluntary associations start to reduce costs is they start to hire their own printers. They have so they're printing in-house. In the 19th century, you get especially in the United States, you get the rise of tract societies, like the American Tract Society. This is what these phenomena that I'm describing kind of turn into. But that's, a couple decades on. At the moment, so people like John and Charles Wesley, the Methodists, get very interested in this kind of printing, and they have a big enterprise. There are other smaller societies, and they often have like predictably 18th century names like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of the Gospel, and things like that. But they are increasingly working with printers in-house. At the moment that, so I'm not explaining this totally clearly, they had been working with printers in London, job printers. They're taking on job, the printer does the job, prints your books, hands them back to you. Printer doesn't sell them out of his own workshop or bookstore, but hands them back to the person who ordered them. That's job printing. Job printing dries up because voluntary associations start doing this more and more in-house. This, interestingly, is the moment that, this is the moment when religious organizations and novels which had at this point existed for 50 years, recognize themselves as being in competition because they're actually belonging to different market shares, or what we would now retroactively call market shares. And so the kind of height of anti-novel discourse where you have ministers denouncing novel reading from the pulpit, all of this comes in the 1790s, which is really long, whereas Pilgrim's Progress, 1678, Robinson Crusoe, 1719, right? So these things had existed, Pamela, 1741. So these things had existed for a long time before they're getting denounced. And it seems to me that the economic kind of back end is part of the fact that these different kinds of books are no longer sharing a genre or a printer or a bookshelf. Like, this is what is promoting the denunciation. It's actually a sense of competition. And that's the kind of secularization argument, is that it shows up really late, but it has to do not with the fact that the novel is kind of born secular, so much as that religious publishing subtracts itself from a London market and starts to compete with that market. Mm-hmm. So whereas Ian Watt called it the rise of the novel, I'm interested in a little bit of like the novel's kind of what's left over. And that is ironically what is the condition of its ascendancy.
Yeah, and while I have the floor and waiting for other questions to come in, you do a really wonderful job sort of distinguishing between the history of the novel being the sort of icon of national identity, some of which I think was superimposed after the fact, of course. Mm-hmm. And then you have the history of the book, which is fundamentally international. Yeah. And you've been talking about London printers. Does your project take you into US-based printers, and are they operating under different constraints with different motives that?
Yes, yes and yes. I came to the Library Company on a postdoctoral fellowship in 2009 to tell a story about printing in the 18th century in the United States. And what I rapidly learned, I mean, a lot of things, but one of the things I rapidly learned was that bookstores in places like New York and Philadelphia in the 1740s are selling a lot of books that are printed in London. And it has to do, there are economic arguments. Jim Green and Peter Sallybras's book on Benjamin Franklin lays this out really persuasively. But it's just because paper is expensive, because in colonies, in colonial economies, these kinds of materials are more expensive because they're more rare. Type, paper, presses, the labor, and the know-how to do the work. For all of those reasons, it's always going to be more expensive to print larger and longer works in the colonies than it's going to be to ship them in from London. By the time of the American Revolution in 1776, when importation slows down, 50% of what's being printed in London is being exported to colonial markets. The biggest ones are North America, the Caribbean, and India. But a lot of London printing is being exported out of London. But anyway, so this is what, like how did I become somebody who's interested in London? Well, it was because the archive kind of led me there. Having said that, yes, I spend a lot of time, I continue to have some stripes as Americanist, and I spend a lot of time trying to think about the relationship between colonial printing and metropolitan printing. I'm very interested if books like early novels like Pamela are being printed in London, they're being pirated in Dublin, they're being shipped and smuggled into the United States and existing in markets here. I'm very interested in how readers take these things up. If we talk about the reception of Pamela, are we talking about the London reception? Are we talking about the provincial reception, the colonial reception? Because while all of these spaces are sharing books, they're not necessarily sharing like the New Yorker, right? They're not sharing like periodical discourse and ways of reflexively commenting on books. And so I try to track these things very much, is the answer.
Yeah. I wonder if I can just sort of invite you to take us into sort of another one of your threads, and then I'm going to jump over to questions here. But one is about character, which is something we associate with novels, and you tie it to Protestant confessional writings. Can I ask you to unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. I said that, you know, the dominant arguments about the rise of the novel are formal arguments, and I'm trying to make a materialist argument. This does not mean I think that formal arguments are wrong. I think that there's a lot to learn from them, as I hope I already indicated in my admiration for folks like Caroline Liddy and Anna Kornblue. But I think that there's more to the story. So what I tried to do in order to make good on that, what I tried to do in the book is to sort of say, let's pick a formal feature that is strongly identified with the novel. And the one that I came up with is character. Novels tend to have characters. Whereas, like, for example, like lyric poems don't necessarily. So I tried to track the evolution of character and this formal aspect. And I tried to say, well, if a novel like Pamela and a missionary diary like the Life of David Brainerd are both being printed in the same kind of small formats by the same printers, right? Is that a coincidence? Or are there some kind of formal continuities between works that we now recognize to be novels and works that we now recognize not to be novels? And character was the test case. And, you know, to make a long story very short, like, yes, there are a lot of continuities. At least that's what I try to argue.
And of course, people need to buy the book, which I plugged in the chat feature, to really explore all that nuance.
Find out more. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We have a question from Paul Erickson. Hi, Paul. What percentage of mid-18th century books in England were printed in folio? What sorts of texts, other than Johnson's dictionary, were printed in that format?
That's a super great, interesting, and fair question. I don't know is the answer. I don't know, at least I don't have like statistical numbers, data off the top of my head. Folio printing, what I can say is that it is just simply very expensive. And so it's largely reserved for works that are understood, that are either subvened, and this happens, a gentleman scholar writes a book and is willing to kind of support the publisher, the printer and publisher in the publication, that happens. But Peter Sallybras's once said to me, all publishing is vanity publishing. And there may be something, from an economic angle, and there may be something to that. But that said, usually scholarly books, Bibles, works that are understood to be learned or important. There's a fantastic book by Margareta de Grazia that I cite several times, but that I absolutely love, called Shakespeare Verbatim. And what she does is she studies the 18th century publication of Shakespeare. Wait, you say Shakespeare lived in the 16th century. That's right. But he was reprinted in the 18th century, and it is these subsequent editions that she argues do a lot to make his reputation. The fact that Shakespeare was published in folio is actually, in the history of folio publishing, just super weird, because plays were not the kind of text, generically, were not the kind of text that show up in this format. The fact that they did seem to lend, and has historically lent, an enormous amount of importance to Shakespeare. But what Margareta de Grazia does so brilliantly is she tries to lay out a kind of materialist argument. The publishing history of Shakespeare reveals things about why Shakespeare's reputation takes off where and when it does. It's an interesting argument. My take on it, my riff on it, my dependence on it is simply to say that there are just generically kinds of things that aren't printed in certain formats or aren't typically. And so plays or fictions, poetry, these things are all going to be small format, Oriental tales. It's also the case that, and there may be more questions, but, and I have a tendency to talk too much, so cut me off. But I was going to say that folios are more expensive to print, but they can therefore kind of only be owned by, purchased by, in order for the publisher to make back the cost of paper, they have to sell at a higher price point. So they're owned by people who have ready money. But it's also the case that a folio is not the kind of book that you can like stick in a pocket. It's not the kind of book that you can read on your lunch break. It's meant to exist in a different kind of more learned, more erudite, more reserved space. And I think part of the reason that hymn books, devotional works, our psalters are printed in smaller formats is because they're devotional books that are meant for people who don't have designated reading time, but that are kind of, they're works that can, as it were, fit in a pocket. And that matters, I think. So part of the answer, Paul, is genre, and part of the answer is imagined use. And I think, and also cost, and all of these things are going together to kind of figure out to determine which kinds of books, which kinds of genres end up in which kinds of formats. So I don't have a direct answer, but that's, if I were going to answer your question, that's how I would answer it.
Quick question from Caroline Schimmel, who asked, when did Harvard buy Pamela?
When did who?
When did Harvard buy Pamela?
I don't know. Oh, Harvard. I don't know. I don't know, actually, off the top of my head. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I mean, listen, some of my questions require a little more digging. We have a comment from Carrie Bryan. It's a nice one. This has been a most interesting presentation. It never before occurred to me to consider what, if, or how relationship between Pilgrim's Progress and Pamela. The common ground is the basic story of a protagonist confronted by various moral challenges and finding a path to redemption. But then we go from Richardson to Fielding fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Continuous, what I can say is that, I mean, continuous narrative had, what makes, in my account, what makes Pilgrim's Progress really kind of interesting and special is that it presents the kinds of piety and the kinds of concerns that exist in devotional books, but it does so as a continuous narrative. Readers really seemed to jive with this. People really seemed to like it. The shift from kind of desultory or random access reading, where the codex is a random access technology. I can open any book to any page at any time. If I were, for example, reading a scroll or scrolling through a website, I couldn't necessarily do that. I would have to be motivated to do that. So the random access feature of the codex is something that it seems like readers are using in the 17th century until more or less they sort of suddenly stop. And why people get interested in continuous narrative is not something I've been able to answer, but they really seem to. But these kinds of continuous narratives exist. And so while there are important kind of thematic continuities, I think, between Pilgrim's Progress and Pamela, there are other kinds of continuous narratives in circulation, and Fielding is certainly drawing on these things. One thing to just observe is that Richardson, in a kind of famous letter, he writes that he invented a new species of writing. And that's and people who are invested in the kind of rise of the novel, invention of the novel story, have quoted this line often. But it seems to me that one, readers don't tend to like things that are wholly new. They like things that are innovations on what they know. And two, if you start to trace the formal features of Pamela, the material features of Pamela, the field of citation, the things that it's drawing on, making reference to, you'll see that it's not that new. It's continuous with a lot of what people were reading. The fact in some ways that it dresses it up morally is maybe the innovation. But anyway, thank you so much.
We have another question from Matthew Hogan, who asked, hey, Matthew, as you contrast folio octavo formats for their genre associations, reading style, production cost, prestige, etc., would you say that those trends changed much with the rise of 19th century publishers' bindings in comparison to individualized binding prior to that?
That's a great question. Yes, is the short answer. I think what starts to also, so the anti-novelism that I'm interested in the 1790s, the moment when there is, I think, this bifurcation between, you know, for lack of better terms, what I call religious publishing and kind of mainstream London publishing. And this is the moment of where novels start to be condemned by religious authorities. It's a moment where it's through that condemnation that in certain ways the genre crystallizes. The term novel comes into very definitive use in the 1790s. Other terms had been used, history, letters, lives, and other kinds of genre terms are getting thrown around, and novel is what kind of crystallizes. Once that happens and publishers kind of get in on it, and also at this point, like, novels have been around like in some form for the better part of 100 years, but now there's a name to attach to it, and publishers start to very deliberately market texts as novels. If I had to pick a kind of maybe decisive case, I'm prepared to guess that it might be Walter Scott. But I don't know that for certain. But certainly Scott is enormously like influential as a genre, but is a huge kind of economic. He's an author who makes he writes a lot of books, but he makes a lot of money, and people and there's a lot of sets of Scott's novels. And I think that's definitely part of the story. But it's a good question.
Right. We have another question from Nathan Douglas.
Hey.
Hey there, Nathan. He says, hi, Jordan, glad to see you. I really appreciate, or I really enjoyed your book's material history of the novel as a physical, not only discursive form. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how your argument about the material form of the novel interfaces with or pushes against other accounts of the novel that have perhaps taken its material history for granted in order to make arguments of a different order. For example, Anderson's argument about the widespread character of print capitalism as a material basis of 19th century bourgeoisie nationalism's imagined communities.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. This is, in some ways, like, this is the book I haven't written yet. I'm actually working on these things. Something happens to you, like you turn 40 and you suddenly are interested in economics. And I find myself, or maybe whatever, it's 2020 and everybody's a Marxist now, but I find myself getting really interested in the kinds of economic history. So the Anderson argument, but a lot of arguments in the historiography of the book sort of presumes that the books are commodities. They are exchanged, they are produced by industrial labor and exchanged at market prices to anyone with ready money. So they are commodities, no one disputes that. But the economic aspects of the book trade are usually kind of taken for granted. Like there is an economic footing. Something like religious societies giving books away for free challenges that. And while there are economic circumstances to the publishing of books, and there are economic circumstances that are motivating religious societies, voluntary associations to make decisions about how and when they're printing and what they're printing, these are books that are being, this is an aspect of book history, right? But these things aren't then being exchanged as commodities. They're being given away as devotional tokens. In the book that Lara Cohen and I edited on African-American print culture, we noticed through a number of the essays in that book a similar phenomenon where you have African-American authors who are very interested in the circulation of their text. They're not necessarily interested in making money off of them. They're not opposed, but that's not why they're not there to be in business. So while the historiography of the field of book history has kind of presumed that there is there's a relationship between book history and the history of capitalism, there are a number of cases where this doesn't bear out. And this is something that I am trying to get a handle on, trying to research. I did spend a little bit of time, to answer your question in terms of the research I've already done, I did spend a little bit of time trying to understand, like, everybody knows that the novel is really important to English national identity, to the Anderson argument, to kind of the imagined community of the British nation. I was tracking, and I'm relying on secondary sources here because I don't have the competence to do the economic history myself, but I'm trying to find things on research on like GDP in Britain in the 18th century. And the moment between 1750 and like call it 1775, in that quarter of the century, which is when the novel is really in ascent, the national GDP goes down. And there's presumably other reasons for it, but it doesn't seem like novels are having a huge economic, I mean, they become the thing, they become the kinds of books that people want to read and want to buy, but they don't necessarily grow the market, if that makes sense. Like people are reading them instead of other things, which I think is what religious authorities are complaining about. So I think that the economic and in that sense, the material side of the history of the novel is a little bit more complicated than I was even able to figure out. And it is what I am condemning myself to spend the next 10 years trying to unknot. So Nathan, catch me then. But it's an excellent question that I hope to have a better answer to eventually.
I know this is a really annoying thing to do because you're at the beginning of this 10-year journey, but I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about this. Like, talk to me a bit about the shape of this project that you're working on.
Well, I mean, I don't know yet. I don't know what the narrative form will be, but these are the questions that I'm just trying to track. Is what is the relationship between the history of the book and the history of capitalism, effectively, which I think there is widespread agreement sort of takes off toward its industrial forms in the 18th century. And I'm just trying to kind of, track these different developments. I'm leaving genre behind, unless it comes back, we'll find out. But the thing I was going to say was that in the historiography, and a lot of this is coming out of the French, the Annales school, folks like Roger Chartier, like really brilliant book historians doing incredibly detailed work. But one of Chartier's questions, one of the kind of classic questions for the French in book history is, do books produce revolutions or do revolutions produce books? And right, did the French Revolution happen like because of Rousseau, which is the joke that gets made in Les Miserables, like this is the fault of Rousseau, right? That's a 19th century reckoning, right? Is the revolution the result of a shift in ideas, and this is the kind of Enlightenment account, or does the revolution happen and then produce different ways that we understand books that maybe get predicted retroactively or maybe don't, but that maybe also foment things like the bourgeois novel in the 19th century? So this is the question: do books produce revolutions? Do revolutions produce books? I find myself wanting to get into this not as a history of ideas question, but actually as an economic history question. And so I've been in the weeds a little bit, trying to understand things about pre-revolutionary censorship in France and copyright, how it looks different than it does in England or in the United States. How the transition to capitalism with the advent of the French Republic looks different than the transition to capitalism with the advent of the American Republic, which yet looks incredibly different than the transition to capitalism in the Haitian Republic. So I'm poking around. If I'm able to answer these questions, I hope you'll agree, like this might be an interesting account, but I'm not quite there yet. But these are the things that I am trying to think about. But it is insofar as when novels or books is it is still me being a literary scholar, which is what I was trained to do, and kind of thinking about genre and thinking about literary form in relation to a material history. I find myself moving away from that and actually kind of getting into the history. But again, like all things that are repressed, the literary may return in my account. I catch in 2 years and we'll know. But that's where I am at the moment.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't note that in addition to having excellent resources for somebody who's interested in book history, as you well know, we have a program in political economy and society, which Kathy Matson, I think, would be very interested in this, and perhaps you'd be interested in a fellowship when the time is right.
Noted. Thank you.
All right, so we have another question from Marcy Dinius.
Hey, Marcy.
Hi, Jordan. I'm a bad friend who hasn't read your book yet, but I'm curious about questions you're considering with respect to the history of racial capitalism and the history of the book.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That's the thing I didn't say, but but it was my incredibly good fortune to have to work with Harvard University Press, wonderful to work with at every level. But they sent this book to the best imaginable readers, and I got like really thoughtful and encouraging, but also like really helpful readers' reports. One of them was from Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, who I've known for years and admire hugely as a scholar, and she laid out an argument in her readers' report about how this book, which has very little to say about race, actually was like an account of racial capitalism, and it was a really, there's a moment in the acknowledgements where I say, like, how much I appreciated the readers' report, but due to limitations of time and patience, I couldn't do everything that was recommended. This is exactly what I was talking about. It seemed to me that there was a knotty and complex history here that I didn't, that I had gotten too far along in my writing before I realized I didn't have an account of. And so part of what this next project is trying to do too, is to think, if I'm thinking about the relationship between the history of the book and the history of capitalism, that's absolutely a history of racial capitalism. One of the ways that we look for the presence of non-white people in the history of the novel, but in the history of book production, is in terms of authorship. And this is the thing that Lara's and my edited collection was trying to expand on. There are more categories of book production. There are more aspects of the history of the book than authorship, important as it is. And so what I'm in some ways trying to figure out how to produce an account of, figure out how to produce a historiography for, is not just a relationship between the history of the book and the history of capitalism, but the history of the book and the unmarked and unremarked upon racial dimensions of and colonial dimensions of capitalism. So I'm looking, I mentioned I'm looking at France, I'm still interested in the United States. Haiti is an emerging, the New World Revolutions of Haiti, the printing, which starts as French colonial, but then becomes something else under the Haitian Republic. First, the kingdoms and the republic. But anyway, that is interesting to me. I'm trying to produce an account of it. The differences here are interesting. France as a kingdom that becomes a nation, the United States as a set of mercantile colonies that become a nation, Haiti as a plantation that becomes a nation. And so, or plantation colony. And so I am interested in these different capitalisms and how they might produce different kinds of histories of the book. But again, at the beginning stages, but I appreciate the question in part because I was able to give an account of what I was doing without mentioning the racial and colonial aspects of what got me interested in this. And I should stop doing that because they are absolutely central to the project. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to give the last question to Cheryl Thurber, who writes, in the 19th century United States, most of the U.S. religious voluntary associations were not giving away their materials, but were selling them cheaply.
Yes.
The two I am thinking, or that I'm most familiar with, are the American Sunday School Union, ASSU, and the American Tract Society, ATS.
Mm-hmm.
ATS use, colporteurs, who sold the tracts, and ASSU continued to job lot their printing and stereotyping. In fact, they emphasized that they did not own presses, etc. Do you know why they would not emphasize
I don't offhand. I know a little bit less about the 19, but this book, the book that I wrote basically stops in 1800, although there's an epilogue that carries us forward. And I know things about the 19th century, I like to think, but the depth of my knowledge drops off there. I did mention drug societies though, so it's a super fair question. What I can tell you is that in Britain in the 18th century, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out if voluntary associations are giving away tracts and other things for free, or whether they are charging like a nominal, like minimal cost. It seemed to me to be a detail that the archives themselves equivocate on. And it's not something I pronounce in my account, but it is my impression. One of the things that seems to be recommended by especially more affluent voluntary associations in Britain in the 18th century is that they recommend that society members are ponying up money to have these texts printed. They then ask, the society asks its members to then buy them and give them out for free. So there is a cost attached, but it's not attached to the unwashed poor who will eventually read it. It's a cost that comes out of the society. So the people are effectively paying for these books twice, once as subvention and once as commodity. This is recommended in society manuals. I don't know how widespread it was in practice. It's certainly something that is talked about, but again, like to actually find the record that shows me that this really happened was not easy to land. But I think if what 19th century tract societies are doing is that they are at a very minimal or nominal cost, trying to recoup some expense more in the aggregate than in the individual case, that's not inconsistent with what was already happening in the 18th century and in Britain. But I, despite trying to research this in some amount of detail, like there are details that seem ambiguous. But anyway, I'm sorry to give you a non-answer there, but it's a great question.
Great. Well, I think we are just about on the precipice of 8 o'clock, and the longest week I think many of us have endured for a while.
Yes.
Thank you, Jordan. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for tolerating my technical difficulties, and thanks so much, friends, for coming and for the great questions. And there's no place I'd rather be than the library company, so it's nice to have a virtual encounter there.
Well, you're always welcome. As I said, Pease Fellowship. And in the meantime, to all of you, pick up a copy. Not only is it a remarkably sophisticated book, but it's also quite a nice material object. And you can support an excellent press by purchasing it through the link that I put into chat. And of course, if you like this, we're going to keep going forward, even if like American democracy collapses all around us. We're still moving ahead with this. Aaron Powells and Erica Piola, our director of the visual culture program, will be leading the first part of a 2-part fireside on art and spectacle in the 19th century United States. Hope you all can join. Thank you again, Jordan.
Thank you.